Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. I've been wanting to talk about this article for a little while, but there's been a lot of other stuff that's come up in the meantime, including another successful flight of the Starship. If anybody wants to see a video on that discussing it, honestly, I am a little confused about exactly why they went ahead and launched it. So if you want to hear me talk about that, let me know in the comments and I'll be happy to do that. Anyway, you can see this was dated right at the end of September of 2025, and it's Joanna Stern and it's Decoder, although this is reposted on The Verge. I will leave a link to that in the description as well. Anyway, you can see a bunch of preamble and stuff. I've highlighted the important parts of this. What I really want to talk about is how Ford CEO Jim Farley is positioning himself and the company Ford in terms of the global competition, in terms of Tesla, definitely versus Tesla, but also versus China, and how some of what he's saying sounds really, really good. And he's really on it with that. But other aspects of what he's talking about either reveal that he doesn't exactly know what's going on, which I think is less likely the case, and more likely he is spinning things a certain way for the benefit of his company. So the interview itself rambles a little bit, so I'm sorry, I'm going to sort of follow the timeline of the interview. And again, I'm not going to touch on all the questions and everything. Go ahead and read the entire interview if you want it. It's 27 pages, so it's a pretty good chunk of stuff. But anyway, I want to focus on some specific things, and I'll go through sort of as the conversation flows. So a few thoughts from Joanna before she actually starts the interview, and this is post-interview, of course, this is talking about this. Ford released a universal EV platform. Interestingly enough, just as the EV tax credits and everything are dying in the United States, and obviously we will talk about that more in the rest of this, but specifically he called it their Model T moment for EVs, which is a cool way of putting it. The idea that they're moving from niche products to mass manufacturable products, that's a big point of what Jim Farley's talking about. And also, of course, there is a general weakening of demand for EVs in the US, especially now that it's October and the EV tax credits have officially ended. I have a feeling there's probably a big bubble in September. In fact, we did see that with Tesla sales and everything, but October, November, December are going to be really rough in the United States in terms of EVs, and Ford is a highly US-centric company at this point. So this affects them a lot more than many other companies, including Tesla. And of course, as he says, China is in some respects miles ahead of the West. I would say in most respects miles ahead of the West, especially companies like Ford and GM, etc. So they've got a lot of catching up to do. And very interestingly, it's refreshing to see that somebody like Jim Farley is willing to say that this is a risk and it could very well fail. So that at least is refreshing to see somebody admit that. So Joanna actually owns a Ford Mustang Mach-E, and she asked him several questions about that. But the reason why I want to touch on that at this point is because it really shows a difference between Ford and Tesla. But anyway, Jim starts off by saying, we just won the revised Model Y versus Mach-E drive evaluation by a pretty respected magazine. I don't know that magazine. I find that a little hard to believe with the new Model Y, but to each their own. And a lot of these magazines, I don't really put a lot of faith in there, especially driving evaluations and stuff. But anyway, putting that aside, let's move down to the meat of the interview. So speaking of the Ford Universal EV platform, Jim Farley said, it's a platform that will be out in 2027. So that again is a year and a half from now, or potentially almost 2 years from now, if it's late 2027. We learned so much from the Mach-E, which I completely believe. We've been number 2 to Tesla. We're a long way behind them, but we're number 2 in the US market in EV sales. So basically that means we're looking at about 8 years between the Ford Mach-E and whatever this next generation product will be, which sounds like it's a small truck kind of idea. But that reveals just how different a company like Ford is from a company like Tesla. Yes, Tesla, of course, released the Model Y in 2019, and so that's about 7 years themselves. But the Model Y today, even the same all-wheel drive, two-motor version that you would have bought in 2020, is radically different than the car that was purchased back then. Tesla makes changes constantly. They're always making changes. Very, very famously, Joe Justice has talked about that at length. So your Tesla Model Y today, even though it has the same name badge, is going to be incredibly different and feels very, very different. I've purchased 2 versions. I had a 2020 Model Y and then a 2024 Model Y that we currently drive, which of course is the last generation now. But the 2 cars, even though they were officially the same car, were radically different in the way that they felt, and the 2024 is substantially better than the 2020. So the fact that a Mach-E that you would buy today is basically the same thing as the original Mach-E that came out in 2019 or 2020, I'm trying to remember exactly when, but anyway, are on the order of the same age as the Model Y. The fact that it's basically the same car makes the Mach-E not nearly as good of a vehicle today as it would have been a half a decade ago, but this is the way that most traditional car manufacturers work. So anyway, continuing on with this question, in order to compete with the likes of BYD, which of course is a Chinese company, who we think is among the best in the world, we had to completely reinvent the platform for the customers. And the basic idea was to develop a vehicle for manufacturability to radically reduce the cost and complexity of the vehicle with all new thinking that is not embedded in a traditional car company. So shocker here, Tesla has really pointed the way to this years and years ago. The idea that manufacturability, the machine that makes the machine, is the most important part. And to their credit, we've seen lots and lots of Chinese companies pick up that flag and carry it. So Ford here is really playing catch up at this point. And as has been noted before, what Ford did, what Jim Farley did, is he set up a skunkworks team that is independent from Ford, the company, the main company, and they have a lot of resources, but they're tasked with a clean sheet build of an electric vehicle platform. So that's pretty amazing. I'm not crapping on Ford all over the place here. I think in terms of vision, they are the second best company in the United States behind Tesla in terms of the vision of building vehicles and building EVs. Now, can they do the quality? No. The quality of Ford's is notoriously bad, and it's been getting worse and worse and worse over the years and could actually bankrupt the company. But in terms of vision, I think that this is the right vision. This is the way to go if you're a traditional car company. And as he finishes up here, he says the first body style of this new EV is going to be a pickup, but really not a pickup. I would say it's a new silhouette. So I, of course, put up here, in other words, it's a Cybertruck. So I doubt it's going to be a Cybertruck, but it's probably going to be some sort of weird SUV pickup truck kind of hybrid thing. It might be sort of along the lines of a Maverick, but if he says it's a new silhouette, then it's going to look different. So I don't know. Maybe it'll look like a Rivian. Maybe it'll look like a cross between a Rivian and a Maverick and a Cybertruck or something. I don't know. But anyway, it's only rear wheel drive. And as he talks about throughout this interview, it's designed to be very inexpensive. It's designed to be simple and not have a lot of stuff, which there are big advantages to that. And so I agree with that, but you're also at that point sacrificing a lot as well. So then Joanna's question is the move to put this new platform out against this backdrop enough? Is it enough to compete both here and in China? And Jim says in North America, it's absolutely the right strategy, but not globally. And I think that's probably the right answer. And here we get back to that ridiculous 5-year car cycle, which is very, very antiquated at this point. GM has 14 nameplates. We have 3. We came out with our vehicles 4 or 5 years ago, and it's coming out with them now. So basically they're saying like, oh, the Mach-E is like 5 years old, so what do we care? That's just the way it is. If you look at Tesla, the Tesla Model Y, like I said earlier, is radically different than the Tesla Model Y that was a 2020 Model Y. And that's the way you need to do this in the new world. You can't just have a cycle that goes on for 5 years with no real changes in the vehicles anymore. That's not adequate. That's not the way that China works. It's not the way that Tesla works. And so these companies need to learn how to build faster. They need to learn how to iterate faster. And then we get to the big quote that people have pulled out and posted online. The competitive reality is that Chinese are the 700-pound gorilla in the EV industry. There's no real competition from Tesla. Hold that thought for a second. GM or Ford with what we've seen from China. It's completely dominating the EV landscape globally and more outside of China. They have 20 million units locally and about 11 million are EV, so half that market. We're barely at 1 million vehicles here in the United States. That's 1/10 of China's volume, and Europe's only twice as big as us, so maybe only 1/5. So first of all, a little reality check here. Tesla's September 2025 sales in China rebounded with 90,000, almost 91,000 vehicles sold, a 2.8% year-over-year increase and a 9.2% increase from August. So they have a new Model Y that's out, so obviously that's going to make a difference with things and it's going to increase their sales. But basically what Jim Farley is talking about here is not actually true. Tesla is competing very, very well in China. They are doing really, really well. And remember, that doesn't have the US bump of EV incentives disappearing at the end of September. So this is much more of an organic increase in sales. So at nearly 91,000 units sold in September, clearly the Chinese like Teslas and they are still purchasing those Teslas. So I think what Jim Farley is talking about here is not accurate. I think that Tesla is competing in China. Now, everybody else, absolutely not. But even more importantly here, he is very accurate. If you're looking at 1 million units of EVs sold in the United States versus 11 million in China, and of course that China is manufacturing more vehicles than anybody else in the world at this point as a country, what that means is wherever China is going is where the rest of the world is going. It doesn't really matter what anybody else thinks. The direction that China is going is the direction the world is going, even if we're resistant to it. So that's a really, really important takeaway here, is that everybody else has to compete with China on their footing. Now, has the US put up a whole bunch of walls against that for now? Yes, they have. But again, it just isn't going to matter in the long term because China is going to flood the market eventually. And even if they don't in the United States, it's just going to be an outlier that really doesn't matter to the rest of the world. And here's an important point. There's hundreds of companies. They're all sponsored by their local governments. So they have huge subsidies. And also important, it's new brands. It's BYD and Geely and companies like NIO and Xiaomi, many of which have never been in the car business before, and that's a big advantage for them. So Jim Farley here is admitting that number one, the subsidies really help, and China's subsidies help a lot. And number two, that not being a traditional car manufacturer is actually an advantage here. So I like that transparency. I don't know if he meant to be quite that transparent, but basically what he's saying is that Ford and GM and the likes of those are at a serious disadvantage to these Chinese companies precisely because they were traditional car manufacturers. And so he continues to beat them. We need a completely different approach. 3 or 4 years ago, we saw this affordable customer duty cycle changing with our sales. It became very obvious to me that we had to go outside of Ford, create this Maverick group, which again, that's that skunkworks group, give them resources and stay out of their way, but make sure that they deliver on a completely new approach because the Chinese are so formidable. They have so much support from the government, hint, hint, and very importantly here, their customers have such a high expectation for the digital experience. So in other words, these cars are software-defined cars, not hardware-defined cars. And it really doesn't matter if you have an EV if it feels clunky to drive. And Volkswagen has been the poster child for this. They've created these EVs, but the interface with them is just horrific. And people really don't like them. And, where are Volkswagen's EV sales? I don't even know anymore. They don't sell very many EVs anymore. And then Jim Farley talks about the fact that a $30,000 vehicle is probably the right price point. So that's probably where they're going to be trying to target this vehicle. With a truck body, I find that a little difficult to believe. I think it's probably going to be more like $40,000, but he says, and rightly so, that $40,000 is expensive for now for most people. And of course, knowing that the tax incentive was about to end, he said, that's all interesting. What's really going to move this market is a non-government subsidized affordable EV that people can afford, and that's at a lower cost to use than a used Model Y because there's a lot of those around. So he's actually targeting himself, his new vehicles at used Model Y prices, which are on the order of $30,000-ish. So that's a really interesting target to be attacking, especially because Tesla just released these lower cost Model Ys and Model 3s, but they're still very expensive. They're much more than $30,000. So if Ford can create a $30,000 EV that's reasonable, then actually they might have some sales here. So again, he reiterates that $30,000 price tag, so that's probably what they're targeting here. And then he continues on, and this is very honest of him. There are no assurances we can do this. No one's ever built a car in 3 pieces. No one's offered their own electric architecture at this price, which is true-ish. I mean, Tesla for a period of time did have a car that was approaching $30,000, especially with the tax incentives. Anyway, we've never done it. We've never had 2 large unit castings in high quality. No one's done it. That seems weird because Tesla clearly has 2 unit castings in the Model Y and the Model 3 and the Cybertruck for that matter. I mean, they have these gigantic castings, so it's weird to say that Tesla has not done it. Tesla's talked about it, but they haven't done it. So again, I don't understand what that means because they have. In fact, our manufacturing process has radically moved on beyond what Tesla's ever shown in its unboxing. So we'll have to wait and see what Ford produces. But again, this is mid to late next year. So we're looking at 18 months-ish before they produce this, and who knows what Tesla is going to do in the meantime, because remember that the Cybercab is coming out relatively soon, probably end of this year or early next year, and that's likely to be a radically updated, lower-cost means of manufacturing. So I have a feeling by the time Ford comes out with this, they won't be first. And here's where Jim Farley gets into things, and I think he has the right idea, but then later on in the interview, he kind of backs off this and confuses the matter. He said, let's make a simple one, a simple vehicle first. Let's not try to add all the complexity. Why don't we just make one color, one version, one spec at the beginning and massively simplify the task for everyone? That is a great idea. It is the Model T. You can have any color you want as long as it's black. So the idea of producing one simplified model that's mass manufacturable is a great idea. And then he says, what is the basic level of software capability? And that's also a good point. And then he says what they want to do is they want to focus on hands-off highway operations for the autonomy solution, which does mean that they're going to need cameras and ultrasonic sensors and who the hell knows, potentially LiDAR. I don't know how they're going to do this. But anyway, focusing on hands-free for the highway only, again, not necessarily a bad idea. I think it's more out of necessity than what they want to do because, as you've seen with Tesla, which has incredible IT chops, they're still working hard to get all the bugs ironed out of street driving and everything. Now, are they very, very close? Yes, they are, but it has taken a lot of time and a lot of money, and Ford just doesn't have that kind of opportunity. So going with highway only makes really good sense, but the way that Jim spins it, it's a choice. I think it's a necessity. And then Farley goes on to talk about the challenges of vertical integration. BYD has vertical integration with the batteries. Its batteries are 30% cheaper than what we can buy from CATL. So that's pretty problematic because the batteries are the most expensive part of the vehicle. You don't want to have to be spending more than 30% more than the other companies. So then he says the only way we can beat it was with innovation on the draw on the battery. Now that's a good goal, but I don't see how Ford is just going to magically be better with efficiency of their motors than these Chinese companies that spend a lot of time and effort on the efficiency of their motors as well. It's a good goal, but I don't know that Ford's going to be able to make it happen. And then Farley talks about how much better the Model Y is when they broke it down in terms of fasteners, in terms of wiring, in terms of harnesses, all of that kind of stuff. So again, this was his call to action for his skunkworks team, was to go off and build a car that competes with this, because Ford, building the Mach-E is a very expensive proposition because it's got so much wiring, it's got so many fasteners, it doesn't have unicast parts, it's very expensive to build that vehicle. And then skipping down a ways, we get to the tariffs finally, and this is an interesting take on the tariffs. Ford is the most American company in terms of the quantity of vehicles we make in the US. Over 80% of our vehicles sold are made here. So that's a real interesting way of saying something like that, because Tesla is basically 100% of the cars that they sell in the US are manufactured in the US. And of course, a huge percentage of the bill of materials is from the US as well. So what Farley is doing here is a little bit of doublespeak, because he says the quantity of vehicles. So yeah, Ford makes more vehicles than Tesla for sure. So in terms of the quantity of vehicles, but then he switches and says over 80% of our vehicles sold here are made here. Well, Tesla is basically 100% of the vehicles that are sold here are made here. So he kind of does two different things at once. So that's a little bit of political lying for you right there. It's not exactly lying, but in spirit it's lying. And then we get a really interesting take here, which is because we make the most in the US, we import the most parts, which is really bizarre, because what he's saying is there's no way to avoid having to import parts if you're going to manufacture something in the US. Again, Tesla does a lot of the work inside the United States and Mexico and Canada, but within that North American free trade zone. And what Ford is kind of doing is throwing up their hands and saying, oh, we have to import all these parts and we just put them together. Well, you don't have to. That's what you guys have chosen to do. So again, a lot of corporate speak and a lot of political speak here. But the upshot is that Ford is in dire trouble because they're paying tariffs on all of these parts that they're importing to put together in the US. And so they've been working with the government to try to reduce that. But it's a big problem. And especially because Ford is primarily a United States company at this point, they don't have a lot of global presence anymore. And so, what happens in the US is more important to them than perhaps to other companies. And here Farley kind of admits that. He says, look, if we, built these parts in the US, the vehicle would be $100 to $200 a month too expensive for customers. So really interesting. He doesn't even talk about the cost of the vehicle. He only talks about the cost of financing the vehicle, because that's what the consumer cares about. But it's an interesting way to put that, rather than saying like, oh, it would cost us $15,000 to $20,000 extra to build the car this way. He puts it in terms of monthly financing. So, Anyway, I like the transparency of Jim Farley, but you can see him at points being very, very cagey about the way he's putting things. And very importantly here, he says about 20% of our profit has evaporated because of these parts tariffs. So that is a pretty huge deal. And so I can understand why they would be very concerned. And then we get to the question of the $7,500, rebate for the cars, which expired at the end of last month. We didn't feel we should get a $7,500 check on an EV to make the transition successful. We do, however, need support for the production tax credit on batteries so that we can be competitive with China. So basically, as I said in my note up here, it's like, well, screw the customer. Who cares about the customer? They can pay the extra $7,500, whatever, but we need the help. So help us. Either way, it's a subsidy, but the one subsidy goes directly to Ford. The other goes to the consumer. And what Farley's saying here is screw the customer. We don't care about that. What we care about is getting our subsidies. So that's not a very cool position to be taking as far as I'm concerned. And then of course we get other countries like China and Europe do support their EV customers, which is very true. And of course the current administration in its great wisdom has decided not to do that. I think it is a tragic mistake to do so because it's going to put the US behind, but we will see what happens. And then we get onto the more software centric stuff. There's a lot of discussion about Apple CarPlay and Google's Android Auto and everything. You can see here that Jim Farley says, we don't feel we have the right to disrupt someone's digital life when they get in the car. That's a direct shot at Tesla, which has all Tesla stuff in the vehicle. You navigate with the Tesla, you interact with the Tesla software, all of that kind of stuff. He's basically making it sound like it's advantageous. It's something that Ford wants to do. But again, this is a necessity. Ford does not know how to build that kind of integrated software stack. And the really interesting thing is that over time, he kind of admits that. He's like, what you really need is an integrated stack that's able to stop the vehicle if it sees something in the road, in other words, do some autonomous driving, but also be able to do entertainment and all of that stuff. But we're going to depend on Google's Android Auto and or Apple CarPlay, although that sounds much more problematic. They're going to depend on these third parties to be able to do the software work that Ford should be doing themselves. They should be building this entire stack up from the ground up on their own to be able to make it work as well as possible. But they're clearly incapable of doing that. And that means that metaphorically, their car is being driven by somebody else. And that is not an ideal situation to be in if you're an auto manufacturer. And then Jim talks about having an AI assistant in the car, which is an interesting idea. But again, if they're talking about simplicity, which he talked about before, I don't know that that's super necessary. I think it's a money kind of a thing, because I think that basically you would get a subscription to OpenAI or something like that, and that Ford would get part of that subscription maybe. So maybe ultimately it's a money play. But anyway, he says they've got productivity software. They want to do how you plan your trip, auto-specific things like advanced driver systems, all of that kind of stuff. They want to build that themselves, but then they also want to layer on top of that Apple CarPlay, but they also want to build that on top of Android Auto and everything. So it's very complicated. He says it's a more complicated choice. So, you know, Jim Farley started off by talking about how they have to build a simpler car, something that is software defined, that's simpler, that just comes in one color and one spec and all of that kind of stuff. And then you start looking at this digital aspect of things and it all falls apart. It all becomes very complicated. And again, he reiterates that too. He says we're going to have a tough time because the digital experience gets really messy and we'll have to decide between Google and Apple, to your point. She was asking about that kind of stuff because she likes Apple CarPlay. And the problem here is that you're not in control of your own destiny when you depend on other people to do your software. And again, he just repeats that stuff here. He says the ADAS integration, in other words, the automated driving assistance system with your entertainment system, integration with your entertainment system is crucial because eventually you're going to be, you know, watching a movie or taking your eyes off the road or something when you're going down the highway. Now, he doesn't even talk about city streets and stuff, which is where Tesla is really focusing at this point. And by the way, Tesla already does this at this point, right? If they didn't have the little eye tracking thing on the highway, you could pretty much go to sleep. The car is rock solid on the highway. It just doesn't make mistakes on the highway and drives really, really well. So anyway, what he's talking about in the future for Ford is already there for Tesla. But more importantly, what he's admitting here is that by not having control over the entire stack, they've got problems. And what he's doing is trying to spin that into a positive. It's like, hey, we're giving you what you want because you want Apple CarPlay and stuff. And I thought I wanted Apple CarPlay until I got into a Tesla. And then when I did, I was like, no, Apple CarPlay is stupid. The Tesla software is much, much better. This is a much more refined system than Apple CarPlay anyway. And so while Jim Farley is trying to spin this as a positive, it's definitely a negative. And it's one of the things that could actually be the downfall of the vehicle because people are so into their software at this point. They don't care about the hardware nearly as much, especially in an electric car. There's no real equivalent of the 8-cylinder Hemi engine or something like that with an electric vehicle. You just get in, you just press the accelerator and you go. And here you see him kind of complaining about this fact, the fact that Apple and Google have not done as good a job. He says in China, you either buy a Huawei system in somebody else's brand or you buy a Xiaomi car and it's completely seamless. I wish our tech companies had approached the auto industry that way, but they haven't. So it's like, why are you throwing up your hands? Just go do it yourself if that's what you want to do. And then finally, again, spinning defeat as victory. Listen to how he talks about this. Our number one priority in terms of ADAS systems and stuff is not to be the first one to do his eyes off level 3 highway driving, but to be the best. And then he says he talked to his team and he said, do you want to do highway high-speed eyes-off automation, push a button, watch a movie, or whatever people want to do? Or he was saying, do you want to do city streets and stuff like that? He's putting this as if there was a decision to be made. It's not like Ford has the technical chops to do city-type driving, much, much more complicated. So, you know, he's spinning this as a choice and he's spinning it as we don't want to be the first ones to do this, all that stuff. Not a choice, it's a necessity. And then as a final shot at Tesla, he says all of our AI deployment for autonomous driving is going to be there because we think that, in other words, highway driving, is a cooler problem to solve. It is not. For most average Americans than a robo-taxi. Robo-taxi. So anyway, he's taking a shot directly at Tesla, but he's doing it from a position of, you know, not power. He's pretending like he's coming from a position of power, but clearly he's not. So in the end, you can see that Jim Farley is trying to have a vision. He's trying to push Ford to go the right direction, but he's also in a fairly untenable position. He's in a place where he's got a legacy car company in a situation where being a legacy car company is a huge disadvantage, not an advantage. And he even kind of admits that with China and everything. He doesn't doesn't really admit that with Tesla, but the same is true for Tesla as well. But basically, being a legacy car manufacturer at this point is a gigantic disadvantage. And in my mind, the only way that Ford could really come out of this well and do as well as they could would be to branch off that Skunk Works into its own entire company. So call it Ford EV or something like that. I think they called it Ford Blue at one point. But anyway, make it its own company and let it eat the other company from the inside over time. I think that's the way they'd have to go. So at least in my mind, that's what Ford needs to do. Are they competing with Tesla at this point? No, not even a chance. Are they trying to survive? Yes. Will they survive? I kind of don't think so, but they are trying. So I've got to give them credit for that. Alrighty, folks, that's what I've got for you today. Let me know in the comments what you think about all of this. And while you're down there, if you don't mind liking the video, it really helps out with YouTube's algorithm. And of course, consider subscribing for more of this kind of content. And I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.